Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to get started with Couchbase in ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core in Part 2. I'll be creating a basic CRUD HTTP API, and CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete. This API will be operating on a gift wish list, all the items I want you to buy me for Christmas. I won't be building a UI, but you could use this API with Angular, React, Aurelia, etc. Using Visual Studio 2017, I'm also using Couchbase Server 5.0 Community Edition, which is already installed. I've created one bucket called Demo, and I've also created one user with full access to this bucket called My User, which has a password of password. Now let's start with ASP.NET. So File, New, Project. Under Visual C#, I'll select Web and ASP.NET Web Application. I'm going to put this in my project folder. I'm going to call it Video Part 1. And with the template, I'm going to select Web API and continue. This creates a basic shell site. You can see all the files here it's created. While we're at it, we're going to go ahead and add the Couchbase.NET SDK here with NuGet. So I'll just search for Couchbase Net Client. You can also do this via the command line if you like that better. So I'll install that. The Couchbase SDK allows us to connect to a Couchbase cluster. Couchbase is a distributed database, so typically there are several servers called nodes in a group called a cluster that all act together. A cluster has one or more buckets, which are collections of documents. A bucket is distributed amongst the nodes in the cluster, but is treated as a single logical entity by the SDK. Within a bucket, each document has a unique key and a JSON value. Now for this video, my cluster only has a single node and a single bucket. In production, you will typically have at least 3 and possibly hundreds of nodes, and possibly a few buckets. Okay, so let's write some code in ASP.NET to connect to the cluster. So I'll go here with global asax.cs in the application start, and I'll use something called the cluster helper, which comes with the .NET SDK in the Couchbase namespace. So I'll initialize with a new client configuration. And there's lots of settings here. All I need for this example is set the servers to a new list of URIs. This tells the SDK where all the individual nodes in my cluster are. I only have the one, which is just local. So I'll say couchbase : localhost. So that tells it where the cluster is. I next need to tell it how to authenticate to the cluster. And I'm going to use, as I mentioned before, the My User username and the password there. There's also some ways you can get this configuration from the web.config instead of hard coding it here directly. Okay, now you don't have to use cluster helper. There are some other ways to manage cluster connections, but this is an easy, convenient way to get started. Now, a cluster object is something that should be created only once for an application because it's a very expensive thing to create. And so the cluster helper is going to manage that singleton for you. We also need to go ahead and create an application end, and we'll just say cluster helper dot close to make sure all the resources are released when the application itself closes. So from this point on, when I want to get access to data in Couchbase, get access to a bucket in Couchbase, I can use the cluster helper to do that. And I'm going to use cluster helper to get a bucket, and the bucket is what I'm going to use to do all the CRUD operations. I'm going to be using cluster helper directly, but if you are using an IOC container like structure map, for instance, you could use it there instead. Now we'll create a controller, and it came with home controller and values controller. I'll go ahead and delete those. We don't need those for this example. I'll create a new class here called gifts controller. Doesn't really matter what we call it. And then this is going to inherit from the API controller base class because this is the .NET framework, not the .NET Core framework. And then I'll create a constructor. In this constructor, I will instantiate a bucket object using cluster helper, which has already been initialized, and to say get bucket, and the bucket's name was demo. So I'll go ahead and create that field. So now we have a field of type iBucket. And we'll use this bucket object to interact with data from this point forward. Now before we start writing some code, let's think about the data model a little bit. So I'm going to go into this models folder, create a class. I'm going to call this one Wishlist item. It's going to be a very simple data model for this example. Now remember that a Couchbase document has both a key and JSON value. The key can just be a GUID for our purposes, but you could also use a more meaningful string or some other sort of value in there if you wanted to. Each item on the wish list has a name, which is just a description of what the item is that I want. That's just going to be a string. One other thing we're going to model is that a Couchbase bucket can contain documents of all kinds. So it's a good idea to differentiate documents in case we add more kinds of documents in the future. So let's give each item a type of wish list item. So I'll create a C# class to represent these items. We'll start with the ID. It'll be a GUID. We'll make it nullable here, and I'll talk about why later. But that'll be our key. And we'll have a string to represent the name of the wish list item. And finally, we have a type, which is just going to be a string. Now, what I could do is I could have this return a string of wish list item. And we can refactor this to the more recent C# syntax. That's one way you could do it. Another way you could do it is you could say, just use some reflection here to say type of wishlist item dot name. And so that way, if you change the name of the class, you'll also change the value of the type field here. And there's some trade-offs to that strategy. Use what works in your case. This is going to be fine for our demonstration here. So now we've got our model in mind. We know how the data is going to look. Let's go ahead and prime the database with a couple of wish list items. So I'll go to buckets. Demo you see has 0 items currently. So let's go ahead and add a document here. The first document, we'll give it a GUID. Just paste that GUID in here. It could be whatever GUID you want to. Save that document. And now it gives us some default JSON here to begin with, but I want to put some more meaningful JSON there. We'll start with name. And the first item on my wish list is a Nintendo Switch. And then I'll give it a type of wish list item. And save. So there we have the first item in our wish list is Nintendo Switch. Let's add a second one. We'll give it a different GUID. They do have to be unique. And we'll say, okay, our second item is I'd like to get a monoprice 3D printer. And we'll also give it the same exact type of wish list item. And save. So now we have 2 documents in our bucket, both representing items in our wish list. And this should be the only time that we'll have to enter documents into Couchbase directly for this video. Let's go back over to ASP.NET and let's start with a simple endpoint just to get all the items in the list and return them from the endpoint. Let's call this get all, but we're going to make it a get endpoint, so HTTP get attribute there. We'll specify a route here with an attributes, API/get all, seems like a good route there. And public I HTTP action result, that's what an API controller action needs to return. We'll call it get all. No parameters necessary, we're just going to return every single item in the wish list. Now the easiest way to get all those documents from a bucket in Couchbase is to write a nickel query. That's N1QL, which is SQL for JSON and supported by Couchbase. So let's try out a query here first. If we go back to the Couchbase console, to the query tab here, to the query workbench, let's write a query to get all those items out. So let's say g.star from demo, we'll alias that as g, where g.type equals wishlist item. Okay. The other thing I'm going to put in here is I want to get the key of the document with this query. The key is not part of the document value in Couchbase, so I say meta of g.id, and that will select the key out of there. Now if I go ahead and execute this query, I'm going to get an error message. And that's because there is no index. There's no matching index for this query, so therefore it's going to fail to run that query. Now we could create a primary index, which will allow us to execute any arbitrary query we want to. That's not going to give us the best performance though. So let's go ahead and create an index. Create an index, and we'll call it ixType. on the demo bucket. We're going to index just the type field. So go ahead and execute that. Okay, and now we've got an index created, and we'll go back and run the select query again, execute, and now we have those two items that we entered into the database already. So this is the query we want to use in our application. So to say, create a string here called nickel, and we'll pass in that query we just wrote, format it a little nicer. And then I will use that string to create a query object using the Couchbase SDK. So query request dot create, and I'll pass in the string there, and that will create a query object. Now at this point, if I wanted to add parameters, I could use query.add positional parameter or query.add named positional parameter. I don't have any parameters in this query, so I'm going to omit that for now. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to set a scan consistency to request plus. Now I'm not going to go into much detail about why I'm doing this or how request plus works. Check out the documentation for that information. The short version is that this will give us the most complete results with the trade-off that's a bit of a performance penalty. For this small demo application, we're not even going to notice. Okay, then we'll get the result back. We'll say result equals bucket.query, and we want to get items back of type wishlist item, and we'll pass in the query object to that. So this result object is going to contain the results of the query. They're going to be serialized into a collection of wish list item objects. The result object can also contain things like, was it successful? Was there an exception? And so on. All we care about is the actual wish list item results right now. So I'll just say return, okay, result.rows. And that rows contains a collection of objects that have been serialized into wish list items. Okay, and that's all there is to it. We could go ahead and compile now, and we could try to run this endpoint directly in the browser, or we could try to do it with Fiddler or Postman. I'm going to show you something a little different here. We're going to try bringing in Swagger because it's really easy to do. Swagger is automatically generated tooling / documentation for HTTP APIs like the one we're building now. So the way to do this is to just add a NuGet package. And the one I like is called Swashbuckle. Go ahead and install that. And once that installs, that's all there is to it. It's going to add the library for us. It's also going to generate some code for us, but we don't have to do anything beyond installing this NuGet package to get Swashbuckle to work. Okay? Back to GIFs controller, and we'll go ahead and Control F5 to run this in the browser. And to get to the Swagger, you can just take your URL here and do /swagger, and it will generate this documentation for us. And you can see we have just one controller, GIFs, so I can hide all the endpoints in that. And you can see I've got the get all, so I'll click on that, and you can see that basically Swagger understands that there's no parameters here. All you can do is just hit the endpoint and see what happens. So we'll try it out, and it will generate the curl statement for us. It will tell us what URL it's using, the actual response body, so you can see it's returning all the items like we expect it to. It's also giving us response code and the headers of the response. So that's really handy. We didn't have to use Postman or Fiddler or anything. Let's create another endpoint now, this time to get a single item from the wish list. So this will also be an HTTP GET. We'll give it a route of API/get/ an ID token there. And we'll again action result, get, and we're going to specify a GUID. So you need to specify a GUID because we're telling it exactly which item we're going to pull out of the database. So the endpoint is going to take that document key as a parameter. Now we could write another nickel query here, but it's actually faster to use a get operation since we already know the key. So we'll say result equals bucket.get, and again into wishlist item class, ID, and Couchbase requires a string for the key. So that'll give us the result, and again we could check it for exceptions or error messages, things like that. we could just return OK result.value. So I'll compile, and then we'll go back over to Swagger. And now I've got this getID endpoint here. And so let's go here and try this out again, the getAll, so I can find one of the keys, one of these GUIDs here, collapse that. And Swagger figured out what the parameters are, just based on the code that I wrote. So I can try that out. You can see that it's just pulling out the item based on the ID that I passed in, the body, the response code, and so on. Next, let's create an endpoint to handle both create and update. We're going to call this one post, and it's going to be route of API, let's say edit. Now this is going to handle both create and update. So there are some arguments where one should be put and one should be post. I'm just going to combine them into one to make it easy. We'll call it edit, and we're going to expect a wish list item to be passed in to this endpoint, to be posted. And again, we could use nickel here to do an insert or update, but it's going to be faster and easier to use an upsert operation. Upsert is a combination of update and insert. It will create a new document if it doesn't exist, or replace an existing document if it does. So to handle a create, we first need to check the ID value of the object passed in. So we can say if it is not the case that the item ID has a value, then we can assume that an ID was not given and we're creating a new item on the wish list. So we need to assign it an ID. So we can say item.GUID, new GUID, and there we go. So at this point, whether it had one or not to begin with, it now has an ID. And I'm going to use the upsert, so we'll say bucket.upsert, specify item.id to string, and then we have to specify what type of, or we have to specify what object we're going to pass in to Couchbase. This will get serialized to JSON in Couchbase. Now I could just pass in the wish list item directly, but I don't want to store the ID within the document, and I don't want to allow the user to specify their own type or any other fields that might come in here. If wishlist item got refactored, other items were added to it, for instance, other fields were added. I don't necessarily want to save this to the database, so I'm going to do an explicit mapping here. And again, this is up to you. You can change this to accommodate your own needs. But I'm going to say name equals item.name and type equals item.type. Now I could hard code the type in here as well, because right now wishlist item only has a type that's somewhat hard coded to wishlist item. Again, it's up to you how you ever want to deal with that. And then we're just going to return OK, the item itself, and that should handle both edits and deletes. So let's try that out with Swagger. One other thing to point out is I've left out validation in all these endpoints. For instance, checking to see if name was null or not. That's something you'll want to add to your project as well. Okay, let's go back over here to Swagger. We should see 3 endpoints appear now, and one of them should be a post, which is correct. So I click on this, and you can see that Swagger has generated some documentation for us. This is the sort of model that it's expecting you to pass in. Now we know that the type is generally going to be ignored, and the ID and the name is really all it's going to look at. But if we click this, it'll actually paste a little template there for us, which is nice. So let's use this to create a brand new item. So we can get rid of the ID, because this is not something that's already in the database. And I'll give it a new name. Let's say Yankee Candle Balsam, which is my favorite scent. And I could specify type. I could specify literally anything else I wanted to. It doesn't matter. Those are going to be ignored by the code we just wrote. So we'll go ahead and try that out. You can see that it posted that. It got this response back and a response code of 200. You can see even though I pasted in a type of literal string, it came back with a type of wishlist item. And I put foo bar. Foo bar is not in the response body. If I go back to the get all and try it out, you can see that the Yankee Candle has shown up here. So now let's use the endpoint to update an existing item. So we're going to change this Nintendo Switch here. Let's grab this ID, go back over here, and I'm going to actually paste in an ID this time. So we're making changes to an existing item. And I changed my mind. I don't want a Nintendo Switch anymore. I want the SNES Classic Edition. Again, I could put in some other fields, but they'll just be ignored. Let's go ahead and try this out. You can see the response body here is reflecting what we entered. If I go back over here to Get All and try it out, the Nintendo Switch has been replaced with SNES Classic Edition. Finally, we need a delete endpoint. So let's create one more HTTP delete. We'll give it a route of API/delete with an ID token. And again, HTTP action results, delete. And once again, we're just expecting a GUID. Once again, I could create a NCL query to do a delete using a delete verb in NCL, but it's going to be faster to use that delete action since I already know the key. So we'll say bucket.remove, and it expects a key again, so we're going to pass it as a string, return OK, and we can just return the ID. Very simple operation here. Again, I'm omitting any validation just to demonstrate the very basics. We'll go ahead and compile that. Back over here to Swagger, refresh. We now have delete option here. So I've decided, well, I can't really find an SNES Classic at the price I want. So let's delete that from my list. Swagger's figured out that we need an ID there. We'll go ahead and try that out. It shows you all the curl and URLs and so on. If I go back to Get All, try it out, I no longer have that item on my list. So now you have full CRUD capabilities and basic Couchbase connectivity from your ASP.NET application. For more interesting stuff you can do with Couchbase and .NET, check out blog.couchbase.com. Thank you for watching.